It was 1989, in a small town called Rifle, Colorado. A man decided to spend his day fishing. His dog, full of energy, was running ahead when it suddenly barked and made a strange noise. Curious, the man walked closer to see what had caught the dog's attention. There, half buried in the dirt, was something unusual, a human hand. Before long, the police arrived at the scene. As they dug into the ground, they uncovered the body of a woman. Beside her lay a severed head, with a look of sheer terror frozen on her face. The detectives quickly took note of the brutal scene. At least 25 stab wounds, one of them remarked. Each one is different. The variety in the injuries suggested multiple weapons were used, an axe, a knife, maybe even another knife. So, was it 3 killers, another detective wondered aloud, or a single, twisted maniac with a collection of weapons? One officer thought he recognized the marks of a screwdriver. 4 killers, all targeting one young woman, someone speculated. Another voice chimed in, could be a bayonet from a shovel. The body hadn't been buried deeply, just hastily covered with dirt. It was as if the killers were either in a rush or confident no one would stumble upon the gruesome sight. But, as detectives often say, every criminal leaves behind some trace. Suddenly, a snake appeared near the scene, a venomous viper. The presence of the snake seemed almost symbolic, as if a true serpent in human form had been involved in this brutal murder. The forensic team soon concluded that the woman had been killed elsewhere. They needed to find the actual crime scene and inspect it thoroughly for any overlooked evidence. But the detectives ran into an immediate challenge. The search area was vast, and they knew that time was not on their side. They needed to examine every inch, but if it rained or locals wandered through, any traces could be lost forever. Despite the grim situation, the detectives devised a plan. They decided to enlist the help of the military. However, soldiers are not trained detectives and didn't know what to look for. So, they were given a quick briefing: search for blood, clothing, any objects that might have fingerprints. And whatever you do, don't touch anything with your bare hands. Call the forensic team right away. The soldiers, being disciplined and thorough, followed these instructions to the letter. In just a few hours, 35 soldiers had gathered a large amount of potential evidence. Men's pants, one of them reported. Cans, bottles, cigarette butts, another added. They found a heap of clothing, but the challenge now was to determine what was actually connected to the murder. Among the pile, the investigators' attention was drawn to something peculiar: a medical coat, stained with what looked like blood. Could these clothes belong to the murderer? As soon as they made the discovery, the investigators started thinking about who might have worn that medical coat. They focused their attention on staff from local clinics and hospitals. The coat had a stamp from a city hospital, which led them to question the staff there. A nurse recognized the coat immediately. It belonged to an anesthesiologist named Tom. But when they asked Tom about it, he claimed it had been stolen 2 weeks earlier. The police decided to bring Tom in for questioning. His behavior during the interview was odd. He seemed evasive, sidestepping their questions. This raised suspicions, and the detectives began to wonder if Tom might be connected to the murder. However, just then, a nurse named Alice suggested a different possibility. She mentioned a deranged man who had caused a scene at the hospital about 2 weeks ago. He was the husband of a woman who had recently undergone surgery, and he was furious, demanding answers about his wife's condition and acting aggressively. Tom, the anesthesiologist, explained that the surgery had gone well, but the man was beyond reason. Tom had tried to calm him down and eventually had to escort him out of the hospital. But then, something completely unexpected happened. The enraged man forced Tom into a car and drove him to the outskirts of town. Once they reached the outskirts of town, the madman let Tom go, but not without landing a punch to his face. The blow was hard enough to make blood pour from Tom's nose. The crazed man began shouting about how he would get his revenge, which terrified Tom. Fortunately, a group of tourists happened to pass by and intervened, breaking up the altercation. This gave the frightened Tom an opportunity to escape. In his panic, he tossed his blood-stained coat into the bushes. The police listened to Tom's story with skepticism, especially since he couldn't provide any additional details, not even the name or surname of his attacker. Nurse Alice stepped in once again, recalling that the angry man's wife was named Miller, which meant that must be his last name as well. With this clue, the police quickly tracked down where the Miller family lived. The Millers were known to be a quiet, upstanding family, and when the police arrived, they were greeted by a heartbroken woman. But that's where the story took an unexpected turn. The grieving woman revealed a completely different version of events. According to her, Tom the anesthesiologist had a disturbing secret. He had been taking advantage of female patients while they were under anesthesia, sending the medical staff away after surgeries to commit his vile acts. However, this time, the patient woke up sooner than expected. That patient was Rachel Miller. Rachel was disoriented, unsure of what was happening. Everything felt like a hazy dream: an unfamiliar man's face, a voice whispering something she couldn't make out. After leaving the hospital, she initially thought the experience was just an effect of the anesthesia. But soon, she began showing symptoms of an STD, and so did her husband. The couple started arguing, each suspecting the other of infidelity. It was then that Rachel remembered the unsettling dream she had in the hospital. She began to fear that the man in the white coat was real, and that he had assaulted her, passing on the disease. Rachel confessed everything to her husband, but the problem was, she couldn't clearly remember the man's face. All she recalled was his unsettling whisper. Fueled by anger, Rachel's husband, David, stormed into the hospital, desperate to find the man responsible. When he encountered Tom, who spoke in a soft, calming whisper, David immediately knew he had found the right man. Enraged, he took Tom away. Of course, when the police heard the full story, Tom was brought to justice for his heinous crimes. However, it turned out he had nothing to do with the murder. With Tom ruled out, the investigation continued. The detectives soon realized that the dozens of items found near the crime scene weren't likely to lead them to the killers. They needed to shift their focus to identifying the victim. This was no easy task. The body had been severely mutilated, and there were no clothes to provide clues. The face was also disfigured. The police compiled lists of all missing persons in the city and county, and one investigator meticulously checked every detail. Finally, they came across the name Carrie Ander. Forensics compared a photo of the missing woman with the skull of the victim, and it was a match. Carrie had lived in Rifle Township with her mother and young daughter. One day, she went out to the store, and when she returned, she told her mother she was going on an overnight trip. Carrie never came back. Her worried mother eventually filed a missing persons report with the police. The detectives began digging into Carrie's background, and they soon discovered that she had already been on the police's radar before her death. Not too long ago, some store employees noticed an unattended baby stroller left on the street. Concerned, they quickly contacted the police, who arrived and took the child into their care. Shortly after, a distressed woman appeared, claiming her granddaughter was missing, and that her daughter had lost the child. That woman was Carrie Ander's mother. According to her, Carrie had become increasingly absent-minded lately. She had gone for a walk with her baby but somehow forgotten where she had left the stroller. The police returned the child to her grandmother. However, just a week later, the same incident happened again. This time, the police grew suspicious. They began to think that perhaps Carrie, the seemingly negligent mother, was trying to abandon her child, hoping someone might take the baby off her hands. They called Carrie in for a conversation. She appeared frightened and upset, promising that she would be more careful. Believing her, they handed the baby back to her. But just a month later, Carrie was found brutally murdered. The detectives couldn't help but wonder if her bizarre behavior had any connection to her gruesome death. They were determined to find out. The key to solving any crime is to carefully examine the victim's life, leaving no stone unturned. As the detectives delved deeper into Carrie's history, they uncovered more about her troubled past. Carrie had been a widow. She married young, and by all accounts, she was deeply in love with her husband, Rick. But there was tension from the start. Rick's mother never approved of Carrie. She constantly criticized her, accusing her of infidelity, and planting seeds of doubt in Rick's mind. Rick found himself torn between his wife and his mother, unsure of whom to trust. The strain eventually became too much for him to bear. Consumed by jealousy and unable to reconcile the two most important women in his life, Rick took his own life, leaving Carrie to cope with the aftermath. Carrie struggled immensely after her husband's suicide. She sought help from a psychiatrist and was prescribed antidepressants. Over time, she started to rebuild her life, but something had changed. She became extremely forgetful and absent-minded. It wasn't uncommon for Carrie to leave her child behind in a park or store. Her mother grew increasingly worried about her daughter's erratic behavior. But when Carrie mentioned that she was planning to go on an overnight trip, her mother was actually pleased. She thought some positive experiences might help Carrie move past her grief. The detectives decided it was time to revisit the crime scene. They discovered that the area was a popular spot for tourists, who often camped in tents or came to fish. The police began interviewing regular visitors to the site and learned that there had been a group of people there earlier, 4 men and 2 women, 1 blonde and 1 brunette. The blonde, as witnesses described, seemed to match Carrie's description. The witnesses also mentioned one of the men, noting that he was of average height, thin, with a particularly angry expression. During their investigation, the police also noticed a suspicious man who didn't appear to be a local. They found out that he was just visiting from another city for the weekend, so they let him go. This turned out to be a grave mistake. It was later revealed that this man was one of Carrie's companions on that ill-fated trip. Unaware of his connection to the crime, the police continued questioning the locals. After some time, an important detail surfaced. Someone recalled that one of the men in the group had a gold tooth. Seasoned detectives knew that gold teeth were often a sign of an ex-convict. So, they checked in at the precinct, and, as it happened, a man named Jack, an ex-convict, had recently been arrested for petty theft. The police quickly began to suspect him of being involved in Carrie's murder. Under questioning, Jack broke down and revealed the names of the entire group. There were 4 of them in total. All of the suspects were rounded up within a few hours. It turned out Jack had his own twisted plan. He had committed a minor crime to ensure he would spend a few months in jail, thinking that this would prevent anyone from suspecting him of murder. As the detectives interrogated the group, the criminals disclosed the gruesome details of the murder, though they remained tight-lipped about who had orchestrated the crime. The detectives knew from witnesses that there had been 4 men and 2 women on the trip. One of the women was now dead, but what about the other? Could she have been the mastermind behind the murder? That was the next mystery the detectives needed to unravel. The interrogation of the criminals dragged on for quite some time, but eventually, they broke down and revealed the identity of their leader. To the detective's surprise, the mastermind behind the gang was a woman named Dennis. It turns out that not all crime lords are men. This ruthless crew was under the control of a female criminal mastermind. And the worst part? Dennis was still out there, on the loose. A venomous snake in human form. The detectives headed to Dennis' house, where they were greeted by her mother, a worn-out woman with a kind face, accompanied by two curious little kids. With a heavy heart, the mother admitted the painful truth. Dennis was no longer the daughter she once knew, nor a mother to her own children. She had become a hardened criminal, only occasionally bringing home money without even glancing at her kids. The detectives assumed Dennis was hiding out with her criminal associates, waiting for the heat to die down. The investigators began meticulously tracking down everyone Dennis had ever been associated with, but there was no trace of her. Determined to be unpredictable, they decided to revisit every lead a second time. This unorthodox tactic paid off. When they returned to one particular house, there stood Dennis. She hadn't expected them to double back, and they apprehended her without much resistance. During questioning, Dennis remained silent, but her accomplices were more than willing to talk. They confessed that Dennis had threatened them, warning that she'd cut off an arm or even a liver if they dared disobey her. The gang had originally planned a getaway trip, but by chance, they encountered poor Carrie. Pretending to be her neighbors, they tricked her into joining them. Carrie, who struggled with her memory, couldn't recall these supposed neighbors but decided to trust them, thinking she had just forgotten. So, she agreed to go with them, but Dennis took an immediate dislike to Carrie. Next to Carrie's softer demeanor, Dennis appeared rough, almost mannish. That's when Dennis concocted her cruel plan. She convinced the men that Carrie was a police informant and needed to be eliminated. Without hesitation, they grabbed axes and knives and descended on the unsuspecting victim. Dennis made sure each member of the group took part in the brutal assault. One stabbed her with a knife, another struck her with an axe. Finally, Dennis ordered them to sever Carrie's head to prevent her from being identified. Dennis thought she had bound her partners in blood, ensuring their silence. But in the end, self-preservation won out. Each one of them chose to save their own skin, leading to their capture and trial. The killers received varying sentences, from the death penalty to 12 years in a penal colony, depending on the number of blows each delivered. Although Dennis didn't personally strike Carrie, her role in orchestrating the murder was heinous and calculating. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison for soliciting murder. If she had been a man, her sentence might have been harsher. But in truth, she had long ceased to be a woman in any meaningful sense. She was nothing more than a festering core of evil. One of the officers nicknamed her Cobra, poisonous and isolated. After 12 years in a rough prison, she emerged as an old, toothless, and wrinkled woman who no one feared anymore. Her children wanted nothing to do with her, deeply ashamed of their mother. But that's another story altogether.